Her footsteps were uneven as she ran past the flashing lights outside, past the shouting, past the officers reaching out to stop her. She didn't slow down. Her small hands were trembling when she finally reached him. Tears soaked her cheeks as she clutched his sleeve like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "They're hurting my mama," she cried. "She's not waking up." The conversation around the room died instantly. Chairs stopped moving. No one dared breathe, because the man she had chosen to beg was not someone people pleaded with. He was the kind of man the police warned you about, and in that moment, with every eye watching, he had a choice to make, one that would change all of their lives. Stay with me until the end. Because what happened next was something no one expected. It was late evening in Seoul. The kind of night when business was done quietly and without witnesses. The private dining room was filled with low voices, expensive drinks, and men who understood the unspoken rules. No sudden movements, no questions, no interruptions. This wasn't a place you wandered into by accident. This was Han Jae-kyung's table. For years, his presence alone had kept entire neighborhoods in line. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to threaten. Decisions were made, orders were followed, and consequences were understood. Emotion had no place here. Mercy was a liability. That was how Han Jae-kyung survived, and it was exactly why what happened next should have been impossible. No one spoke while Han Jae-kyung sat at the center of the room. It wasn't because he demanded silence. He never had to. The quiet settled naturally around him, heavy and deliberate, as if the air itself understood the consequences of being disturbed. Men spoke in low voices, leaning in just enough to be heard, careful not to draw attention. Even the clink of glass against wood sounded too loud when it happened. Han Jae-kyung didn't look around to assert his presence. He didn't need to. He sat still, back straight, shoulders relaxed, hands folded loosely on the table, as if nothing in the world could surprise him anymore. His dark suit was immaculate, pressed sharp enough to cut. Not flashy, not loud. Power didn't need decoration. Around him were men who controlled districts, money, and lives. They waited. They always waited. When Han finally spoke, it wasn't raised or rushed. Just a few words, calm and precise. Numbers were corrected. Decisions were finalized. A single glance was enough to shut down a disagreement before it formed. This was how it had always been. His authority wasn't built on shouting or violence, it was built on certainty. On the understanding that hesitation did not exist here. Jang Tae-ho stood a step behind him, as he always did, silent, watching. He had seen men lose everything in this room without a threat ever being spoken. He had also seen men walk out relieved simply because Han had chosen not to look at them twice. Tonight felt no different. Order was intact. Control absolute. This was a world with rules that never bent. You didn't interrupt Han Jae-kyung. You didn't approach him unless summoned. You didn't bring chaos into his space and expect to leave standing. Emotion had no value here. Sympathy was weakness. And weakness had a habit of spreading if you allowed it room to breathe. Han believed that. He had lived by it for years. It was the reason he was still alive when so many others weren't. He glanced down at his watch briefly, not impatient, just precise. Time mattered. Everything did. Outside these walls, the city moved, suffered, burned, begged. Inside, only decisions existed. That was when the stillness broke, not with shouting, not with violence, but with a sound that didn't belong, a sharp, uneven breath, small, fragile, wrong. Jang's attention snapped toward the doorway before anyone else reacted. Han hadn't moved yet, but something had shifted. Not in the room, in him, because the sound came again, and this time, it was unmistakable. Crying, the kind that didn't care about rules. The kind that didn't understand fear, the kind that had no business being here at all. The door opened without warning, not slowly, not carefully. It was pushed wide with a force far too small to match the sound it made, slamming against the wall and slicing through the room's controlled calm. Every conversation died mid-sentence. Chairs scraped softly as men turned in unison. Irritation already forming until they saw who stood there. She was barely tall enough to reach the door handle. Her hair was tangled, strands sticking to her damp cheeks. Her dress was wrinkled and stained, the color dulled by dirt and something darker that no one wanted to name too quickly. Her chest rose and fell in sharp, uneven breaths, each one fighting the next, as if her body hadn't decided whether it was allowed to stop running yet. For a moment, she just stood there, too small, too broken, Too out of place. Someone near the back muttered under their breath. Another shifted in his seat, annoyed at the disruption. This was not a place for children. This was not a place for mistakes. Before anyone could react, she moved. She ran forward, feet slapping against the floor, stumbling once, but never stopping. Past tables, past men who instinctively pulled their legs back, startled by the sheer audacity of it. A few hands reached out, not to help, just to stop her. She slipped through them all. Jang Tae-ho stepped forward instinctively, his body already moving into position. No one crossed the space toward Han Jae-kyung without permission. No one. But before Jang could speak, the girl reached the table. Her small hands grabbed the sleeve of Han's jacket, fingers curling into the fabric with desperate strength, as if letting go would mean falling apart completely. The expensive cloth wrinkled under her grip. The room froze. Han looked down slowly. Up close, she was shaking. Not dramatic sobs, something worse. Silent, uncontrollable trembling that rattled through her entire frame. Her face was streaked with tears and dust, eyes wide and unfocused, darting as if danger might appear from any direction. She looked up at him, then, really looked. Not with fear of who he was, but with hope for what he might do. "They're hurting my mama," she cried, the words tumbling out between gasps. "Please, they won't stop. She won't wake up." Her voice cracked on the last sentence, breaking completely. The sound cut deeper than any shout ever could. No one moved. Jang waited for the order, the command, the sharp dismissal that would restore balance, but it didn't come. Han Jae-kyung remained still, his gaze locked on the child clinging to him as if he were the last solid thing left in the world. His jaw tightened not with anger, but with something unfamiliar, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a very long time. The rules had been broken, and everyone in the room could feel it. Han didn't pull away. That alone sent a ripple through the room. The girl's fingers were still, clenched in his sleeve, knuckles pale from the effort, as if she expected him to disappear the moment she loosened her grip. He could feel the tremor in her hands, small and frantic, vibrating through the expensive fabric of his jacket. Slowly, carefully, he lowered himself until he was eye level with her. The men around them held their breath. "What's your name?" Han asked. His voice was low, even controlled, but the sharp edge that usually lived there was gone. "As Seo Yeon," she managed, swallowing hard. Tears spilled over again, tracing the same paths down her cheeks. They pushed her. She hit the floor and they kept yelling. I tried to make them stop." Her words came out in broken pieces, like she was afraid that if she paused too long, someone would take her away before she finished. "Who is they?" Han asked. She shook her head quickly, panic flashing across her face. "Please don't make me go back. Please." "I'm not sending you anywhere," he said. That promise landed harder than any command ever had. She took a shaky breath. "The men from the alley. The ones who come at night. Mama said not to look at them. She said to stay quiet." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "They said she owed money, but she already gave them everything." Something cold settled in Han's chest. "How long ago?" he asked. "I ran as soon as they started hitting her," Seo Yeon said. "I ran past the police. Mama said the police don't help people like us." The words echoed through the room, heavy and accusing. Jang's eyes flicked toward Han, then away. Everyone understood what the girl was saying without it being spelled out. This wasn't random violence. It was business. Someone somewhere had been allowed to hurt a woman who couldn't fight back. Han straightened slightly. "Did they have a name?" he asked. She nodded, small and certain. "One of them said he worked for the Red Crane crew." The name landed like a gunshot. The Red Cranes operated under Han's territory. Not officially, but nothing happened in his city without his shadow touching it somewhere. If they were collecting, someone had approved it. If they were beating a woman, someone had looked the other way. Han's hand curled slowly into a fist, not because of the money, not because of the disrespect, because the child in front of him was shaking over something that should never have happened. "They said if Mama didn't pay tomorrow," Seo Yeon whispered, her voice breaking again, "they'd come back." Silence swallowed the room. Han looked at her for a long moment, memorizing the fear in her eyes, the way she stood her ground despite it. Then he reached out, not abruptly, not possessively, and rested a steady hand on her shoulder. "They won't," he said, not loud, not dramatic, absolute. Something in his voice made her shoulders sag, just slightly, as if her body had been holding itself together by will alone. Around them, Men shifted uncomfortably. They recognized that tone.it was the sound of a decision being made, and once Han Jae-kyung decided something, the world adjusted accordingly. For a moment, Han Jae-kyung forgot where he was. The room, the men, the weight of 100 unspoken rules, they all faded into something distant and dull. What remained was the sound of a child's voice echoing in his mind, thin and fractured, carrying fear far too heavy for someone so small. It wasn't the first time he had heard that sound. Years ago, in a narrow apartment that smelled of rain and concrete, there had been another voice, softer, older, asking him why he was late, asking him to promise he'd be careful, asking questions he never answered directly, because answers had a way of becoming regrets. He had told himself that night would never matter again. He had come home to silence instead. The memory surfaced now, without permission, the way the lights flickered in the hallway, the door slightly ajar, the air wrong before he even stepped inside, the way his heart had known before his eyes confirmed it, the blood on the floor, the stillness that no amount of shouting could undo. He had knelt then too, just like this, but there had been no one left to listen. That was the night Han Jae-kyung learned what love cost, and the price had been everything. After that, he stopped believing in mercy. He learned to move first, strike harder, and never leave anything unfinished. Kindness became a weakness other men exploited. Attachment became a liability his enemies targeted. So he cut it out of himself piece by piece, until there was nothing left to threaten. Or, so he thought. Seo Yeon's hand was still clutching his sleeve, grounding him in the present. She looked up at him now, searching his face for something she couldn't name. Permission, maybe, or proof that she hadn't made a terrible mistake choosing him. Her eyes reminded him of the ones he had lost, not in color, in trust. The men around them didn't know this version of Han. They had never seen him hesitate. They had never seen him look past profit, past territory, past consequence. They had only known the man who survived by becoming harder than everyone else. But survival had come at a cost he had never repaid. His jaw tightened as the memory settled into place. The old wound didn't bleed anymore, but it ached the way healed bones do when the weather changes, constant, dull, unavoidable. This was why he had built walls no one crossed. This was why he ruled through fear instead of favor. This was why the city whispered his name instead of saying it out loud. And this was why the child in front of him scared him more than any enemy ever had. Because she had brought something back with her tears. Something he had buried deep enough that he believed it was gone for good. Han straightened slowly, the weight of the past pressing against his chest. His expression hardened, not into cruelty, but resolve. He had failed once. He would not do it again. Han Jae-kyung stood, and the movement alone shifted the room. Chairs scraped softly as men straightened without thinking. Conversations died completely. Jang Tae-ho felt it immediately, the change in the air, the invisible line being crossed. Han didn't rise often during meetings. When he did, it meant something had already been decided. Han looked down at Seo Yeon, who still clung to his sleeve as if the world might tilt if she let go. He didn't remove her hand. Instead, he placed his own over it, steady, grounding. "Listen to me," he said quietly. She nodded, eyes wide, breathing uneven. "I'm going to help your mother," he continued. "But I need you to do exactly what I say. Can you do that?" Her chin trembled as she nodded again. "Yes." He turned his head slightly. "Tae-ho." Jang was at his side instantly. "Boss, get the car. Call Dr. Kim Hyun-woo. Tell him we're bringing in a patient with head trauma. He needs to be ready." Jang didn't ask questions. He never did. But his eyes flicked to the child, then back to Han. Something unspoken passed between them. This wasn't business. This wasn't territory. This was personal. Han straightened, scanning the room. Once, no one spoke. No one dared react. They were witnessing something none of them had seen before, a decision not driven by profit or power, but by responsibility. "Clear the street outside," Han said calmly. No delays. Men moved immediately. Phones came out. Orders were whispered. The machine responded, as it always did. Han crouched again so he was level with Seo Yeon. His voice lowered, softer than anyone in that room had ever heard it. "What's your mama's name?" "Kim Soo-jin," she whispered. He nodded. "How old are you?" 7. 7. The number settled heavy in his chest. "You did the right thing," he said. Running here took courage. Her grip tightened for just a moment before easing slightly. As if those words had loosened something inside her. Outside, engines started. Han stood once more and shrugged out of his jacket, draping it carefully around her shoulders. It was far too big, the sleeves hanging past her hands, but she clutched it like armor. As they moved toward the exit, the men parted without a word. This was no longer a meeting. Whatever had been planned for the night was over. Jang opened the door, cold air rushing in. Han paused at the threshold, eyes hard, voice measured. No one touches her, he said. No one interferes. Anyone responsible for what happened tonight. I want them found. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He didn't need to. Seo Yeon stepped closer to him, small fingers slipping into his hand as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Han Jae-kyung walked out into the night with a child at his side, knowing full well he had just chosen a path with no turning back, and for the first time in years, he didn't regret it. The car cut through the city like it had somewhere more important to be than traffic laws. Red lights blurred past the windows. Horns sounded, then fell silent as drivers recognized the convoy and moved aside without knowing why. Han sat in the back seat. Seo Yeon pressed against his side, wrapped in his jacket like it was the only thing holding her together. She hadn't stopped shaking. Tell me where, he said gently, her small finger lifted, pointing through the windshield. 2 streets after the market. Above the laundromat. Jang relayed the directions without turning his head, his hands steady on the wheel despite the speed. The city felt tighter tonight, every second stretching thin. Han glanced down at the child. You did good, he said again, quieter this time. She nodded, lips moving without sound. Praying, maybe. Or bargaining. They arrived too fast and not fast enough. The storefront lights were still on, flickering weakly behind cracked glass. The door hung crooked on its hinges. Inside, the smell hit first metal, sweat, something broken. Han was out of the car before the engine stopped. Stay with me, he told Seo Yeon. She didn't let go. The shop was destroyed. Shelves overturned. Drawers ripped open and left empty. And behind the counter, crumpled on the floor, lay Kim Soo-jin. Seo Yeon made a sound that barely qualified as a voice. Han dropped to his knees beside her mother. Already assessing, already counting breaths. Blood darkened the side of her head. Her breathing was shallow, uneven. She's alive, he said firmly, more to Seo Yeon than anyone else. Jang was already on the phone. We're here. Severe head trauma. Unconscious but breathing. Han shrugged off his jacket and pressed it gently against Soo-jin's head, applying pressure. His hands didn't shake. They never did. But something inside his chest felt dangerously tight. Seo Yeon hovered close, eyes locked on her mother's face. Mama, she whispered. I came back. I brought help. Sirens wailed in the distance. Han stayed where he was, unmoving, shielding both of them with his body as if the walls themselves might attack again. Men secured the perimeter, their voices low, urgent. Time fractured into moments measured by breaths and heartbeats. When the paramedics arrived, the room filled with motion and commands. Han stepped back just enough to let them work, never breaking eye contact with Soo-jin until they lifted her onto the stretcher. She needs surgery, one of them said. Now. Han nodded once. She'll get it. Seo Yeon looked up at him, panic surging again. Is she going to die? Han crouched in front of her, placing both hands on her shoulders, forcing her to meet his eyes. No, he said. Not tonight. The stretcher rolled out into the cold air. Seo Yeon hesitated only a second before running after it. Han followed, jaw set, every step measured. As the ambulance doors closed and the siren screamed to life, Han pulled out his phone. Find them, he said calmly. All of them. The city rushed past again as they followed the ambulance. Lights tearing through the night. Somewhere behind them, men were already being hunted, and somewhere ahead, a life hung in the balance. They found them before the ambulance reached the hospital. The Red Crane men were exactly where cowards always hid, behind locked doors and loud music, convincing themselves the night had already moved on. A private room above a karaoke bar, curtains drawn, bottles half empty, laughing too loudly for men who knew, deep down, they'd crossed a line. The door didn't explode open. It opened quietly. That was what unsettled them most. Han Jae-kyung stepped inside first, his presence draining the room of sound. The laughter died mid-breath. One man reached for his phone. Another stood to quickly, knocking over a chair. Jang Tae-ho closed the door behind them. Sit, Han said. And no one argued. They recognized him immediately. Fear registered in their eyes, not panic, but realization. The kind that comes when you understand exactly who you've offended. Han looked at them one by one, memorizing faces. Calm, methodical. There was no rage in his expression, only disappointment sharp enough to cut. Which one of you touched her? He asked. Silence. Han nodded slightly, as if he'd expected that. He turned his gaze to the man nearest the table, the youngest, hands shaking despite his bravado. You, Han said. You spoke to the child. The man swallowed. Boss? We were just collecting. That woman. Han raised a hand. The room froze. She paid, Han said evenly. And even if she hadn't, you don't put your hands on someone who can't fight back. Another man found his voice. We didn't know she was under me? Han finished. That landed worse than a slap. You didn't know, Han continued, because you didn't care. You saw someone small, weak, alone, and you decided it was easy. He stepped closer, his shadow swallowing the table. I built this city on order, he said. Fear keeps people in line, but you confuse fear with permission. No one spoke. One man's knee bounced uncontrollably. Han leaned forward just enough that they could smell the cold on him. You will return every one you took, he said. Then you will disappear. Tonight, not to another block, not to another city. You will leave this life entirely. And if we don't? Someone asked, voice barely above a whisper. Han straightened. Then you'll learn the difference between cruelty and consequence. That was all. Jang stepped forward, already dialing numbers, already issuing instructions. The men nodded frantically, eager to agree to anything that kept the moment from getting worse. As Han turned to leave, he paused at the door. You didn't break her, he said without looking back. But you came close. The door closed behind him. Outside, the city breathed again. Han pulled out his phone and checked the time. The ambulance had arrived. For the first time that night, his hands tightened, not in anger, but in resolve. This wasn't about punishment anymore. It was about making sure a little girl's choice hadn't been in vain. The hospital lights were too bright for a night like this. They hummed softly overhead, indifferent to fear, to power, to the fragile line between life and loss. Han stood just outside the operating room, Seo Yeon seated beside him, her feet dangling above the floor. She hadn't said a word since they arrived, her small hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes fixed on the closed doors. Time slowed. Jang Tae-ho approached quietly. It's done, he said. The Red Crane men are gone. Money returned. They won't come back. Han nodded once. There was no satisfaction in it, no relief. Violence hadn't solved this. It had only proven how unnecessary it had been. He looked down at the girl. Your mama is very strong, he said. The doctor is helping her now. Seo Yeon blinked hard, then nodded, as if she were afraid tears might somehow interfere with the surgery. Doctor Kim Hyun-woo emerged an hour later. Mask pulled down, exhaustion etched into his face. Han stepped forward immediately. She'll live, the doctor said. She was lucky. If you'd been any later. Han exhaled slowly. He hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. Seo Yeon stood so fast her chair scraped loudly across the floor. She's okay, doctor. Kim smiled gently. She will be. The girl's knees buckled, relief crashing into her all at once. Han caught her without thinking, steadying her until she found her balance again. She didn't pull away. Later, when Soo Jin slept under clean sheets instead of cold concrete, Han stood at the foot of the bed and watched her breathe. There were bruises that would fade, scars that might not, but she was alive, and that mattered. This time, he hadn't arrived too late. Over the next days, things changed quietly. Hospital bills vanished before they were ever delivered. A new apartment appeared safe, clean, far from the alley that had nearly destroyed them. The men who once preyed on the weak stopped showing up in places they weren't welcome. Word spread, not through threats, but through certainty. Han Jae-kyung's city still feared him. But something else followed his name now, something unfamiliar. Boundaries. He didn't become softer. He became sharper in a different way. Violence was no longer a shortcut. It was a last resort. Power was no longer about how much pain he could inflict, but how much he could prevent. One afternoon, Seo Yeon sat beside him on a bench outside the hospital, swinging her legs. Are you still scary? She asked suddenly. Han considered the question. Yes, he said. She nodded, satisfied. But you're safe. He watched her run back inside to her mother. Laughter replacing fear, for the first time in years. Han Jae-kyung understood something clearly. Power didn't have to destroy to prove it existed. Sometimes it simply had to protect. The morning came quietly. Sunlight slipped through the hospital window, pale and tentative, resting on Kim Soo-jin's face as she slept. The machines beside her hummed steadily, no longer urgent, no longer warning, just alive. That was enough. Han stood near the window, hands in his pockets, watching the city wake up below. From this height, it looked peaceful, almost honest. He knew better, but he also knew it didn't have to stay cruel. Seo Yeon stirred in the chair beside the bed, rubbing sleep from her eyes. When she saw her mother still breathing, still there, she smiled without fear for the first time since the night everything broke. She's still here, she whispered, like it was a secret that might disappear if spoken to loudly. Yes, Han said. She is. Kim Soo-jin woke an hour later. Confusion came first, then pain, then memory. Her eyes widened when she saw her daughter, whole and unharmed, rushing to her side. Tears followed, quiet, grateful, exhausted. And then she saw Han. Fear flickered instinctively. She tried to sit up. Don't, Han said gently. You're safe. She studied him, this man whose name carried terror, whose presence meant danger in every story she'd ever heard. And yet here he was, standing guard instead of casting a shadow. My daughter, she said weakly. She was brave, Han replied. Because of her, you're alive. Soo-jin's gaze softened. She bowed her head slightly, the gesture small but sincere. Han didn't stop her. He accepted it not as tribute, but as acknowledgement. When he left the room, Seo Yeon followed him into the hallway. Are you going away now? She asked. Han knelt so they were eye to eye. Yes. She thought about that for a moment, then reached out and hugged him quick, tight, unafraid. The men down the hall looked away, pretending not to see. Thank you, she said simply. Han nodded once. He couldn't trust his voice. Days passed, then weeks. The city didn't change overnight. It never did. But the rules shifted, quietly, permanently. Exploitation was punished swiftly. Protection was enforced without cruelty. Those who thrived on fear found less room to breathe, and Han Jae-kyung no longer mistook emptiness for strength. Sometimes, when the nights grew to quiet, he remembered the child's shaking hands. He remembered choosing to stand instead of turning away. He still ruled the city, but now, when he looked in the mirror, he no longer saw only the man who survived. He saw the man who stayed, and somewhere in a safe apartment filled with laughter, a little girl slept without fear, never knowing just how much her choice had changed the world of the most dangerous man she'd ever trusted.